Thousands of Jews from around the world are returning to Israel after having been scattered across the planet for centuries. One of the most notable examples of this return, and the one we will discuss in this video, is the return of members of the lost tribe of Manasseh, a fact that has generated great expectation and excitement. Furthermore, we must also consider the return of Ethiopian Jews, many of whom, after years of separation, are finally reuniting with their families and loved ones. This entire migratory movement has sparked profound joy, as it is seen by many as the fulfillment of the prophecies announced thousands of years ago by the prophets. At the same time, it has raised serious questions in the Christian world, which is watching these events with special attention. Could this return of the Jews to their land be the prelude that announces to us that the coming of Jesus Christ is closer than ever? Dear listener, this topic deserves our full attention, and we must not lose sight of everything that is happening in Israel. As we have mentioned on other occasions, Israel is God's prophetic clock, marking the times and signs of his plan. Therefore, I invite you to join me in this fascinating documentary, which I am sure will move your heart and strengthen your faith, because you will see that God is faithful and keeps his word. Before we continue, we want to hear your opinion. Do you believe Israel is God's prophetic clock? Leave us a comment and share your thoughts. Let's get started. There are various ethnic divisions within the Jewish people, a reflection of their historical dispersion across different continents. Today, the three main Jewish communities are Ashkenazim, Sephardim, and, to a lesser extent, Mizrahim. Although Hebrew is the primary language used for prayer, sacred writing, and religious life, each of these groups has developed its own language that reflects its history and cultural context. Ashkenazim, originally from Central and Eastern Europe, speak Yiddish, a Germanic language with strong Hebrew and Slavic influences. This community settled mainly in Germany, Poland, Ukraine, and Russia, as well as in regions of France such as Alsace and Lorraine, located near the German border. The Sephardim, whose name comes from the classical Hebrew term Sepharad, meaning Spain, are the descendants of the Jews who lived on the Iberian Peninsula until their expulsion in 1492 for religious reasons. Their traditional language is Ladino, or Judeo-Spanish, an archaic form of Castilian that evolved differently from modern Spanish, preserving structures from the 15th century. During the 20th century, many Sephardim emigrated to countries such as Israel, France, the United States, and various Latin American nations, especially Argentina. Many of them came from North Africa, Turkey, and the Balkans. In recognition of this heritage, the Spanish government enacted Law 12/2015, which allows descendants of Sephardim to obtain Spanish nationality if they can prove their origin, a special connection to Spain, and knowledge of the language and culture. For their part, the Mizrahim, also known as Mizrahim, which means Orientals in Hebrew, are Jews originating from the Middle East. They come from countries such as Iraq, Yemen, Persia, present-day Iran, and ancient Palestine. Their primary language, in addition to Hebrew, is usually some variant of Arabic. They are the Jewish communities that inhabited the Arab world for centuries before emigrating en masse, especially to Israel, after the creation of the state in 1948. Within this diversity, there is also a minority group known as the B'nai Manasseh, sons of Manasseh, with roots in regions of Burma and Tibet. Also called Shin-Lung, they adopted Christianity in the 19th century as the basis of their monotheistic faith, but maintain that their lineage dates back to biblical times, when Israel was composed of the original 12 tribes. Let us remember that the kingdom of Israel was born from a divine promise. God, in his faithfulness, chose Abraham and promised him that a great and blessed people would emerge from his descendants. Through Isaac, then Jacob, who would be named Israel, and his 12 sons, the tribes that would give rise to the nation were formed. Now the tribe of Manasseh occupies a special place in the history of the people of Israel, not only because of its unique origin, but also because of its prophetic destiny. His lineage begins in Egypt, when Joseph, son of Jacob and ruler of the most powerful nation in the ancient world, has two sons with an Egyptian woman named Asenath. The firstborn was Manasseh, whose name means "God made me forget," reflecting Joseph's grief at being separated from his family. Years later, when Jacob reunites with his son Joseph in Egypt, he adopts his two grandsons, Ephraim and Manasseh, as his own. Thus, Joseph is not listed as one of the 12 tribes, but his inheritance is divided between his two sons. Thus, Manasseh becomes one of the 12 tribes of Israel. During the conquest of Canaan under Joshua, the tribe of Manasseh received a double portion of land, part west of the Jordan River and part east of it. This territorial expansion made Manasseh one of the largest and most strategic tribes, influencing both the highlands and the fertile plains. However, its divided location also reflected a fragmented identity, a characteristic that would mark its later history. Over the centuries and after the death of King Solomon, the kingdom of Israel was divided into two: the southern kingdom, Judah, with its capital in Jerusalem, and the northern kingdom, Israel, whose capital was Samaria. The tribe of Manasseh was integrated into the northern kingdom, along with 9 other tribes. It was in this kingdom that idolatry, disobedience, and abandonment of God's law became more prevalent. As a result, in 722 before Christ, the Assyrian Empire conquered the northern kingdom and took the 10 tribes, including Manasseh, captive. From then on, they became known as the Lost Tribes of Israel. The southern kingdom of Judah held out longer, but its fate was no different. Despite the prophets calling for repentance, the people gave themselves over to sin, injustice, and idolatry. Finally, in 586 before Christ, the Babylonian Empire, under Nebuchadnezzar, destroyed Jerusalem, burned the temple, and took the Jewish people into exile in Babylon. It was a devastating blow. The spiritual center of the people had been destroyed, and the nation was humiliated. However, God did not abandon them. Through the prophet Jeremiah and others, he gave them hope for a return, and so it was. 70 years later, when the Persians conquered Babylon, King Cyrus allowed the Jews to return to their land. Under the leadership of Zerubbabel, Ezra, and Nehemiah, the temple, the so-called Second Temple, and the walls of Jerusalem were rebuilt, ushering in a spiritual and national restoration, albeit under foreign rule. For centuries, Judah lived under the shadow of empires: Persian, Greek, and finally Roman. In Jesus' time, the Jewish people awaited the promised Messiah, but many failed to recognize him. Christ was rejected, crucified, and resurrected, and after his ascension, he warned that Jerusalem would be surrounded by armies and destroyed. That prophecy was fulfilled in 70 before Christ, when the Roman general Titus, son of Emperor Vespasian, besieged Jerusalem, destroyed the Second Temple, and massacred thousands of Jews. It was the end of the temple cult and the beginning of a diaspora that would last almost 2,000 years. The people of Israel were dispersed throughout the world. Persecuted, marginalized, and often hated, the Jews remained a nation without a land, carrying with them the Torah, their customs, their faith, and the hope of returning. Despite centuries of persecution in Rome, in the Middle Ages, during the Inquisition, in the pogroms of Eastern Europe, and finally in the horror of the Holocaust, the Jewish people did not disappear. Against all odds, they survived. And then, in an unprecedented turn of events in modern history, on May 14, 1948, following a United Nations resolution, the State of Israel was officially proclaimed. The Jewish people, after almost 2,000 years, once again had a nation in the same land that their ancestors had inhabited. The return was not without conflict, war, and challenges. However, the restoration of Israel in 1948 is, for many, the fulfillment of the biblical promises that God would not forget his people or his land. Today, Israel is a modern nation, with political and religious tensions, but also with a history marked by the supernatural. From the splendor of the unified kingdom, through the division caused by Solomon's sin, the exile, the diaspora, and the miraculous return, the history of Israel is not only the chronicle of a people, but the living testimony of God's faithfulness to his word. Now we are witnessing a phenomenon that many consider prophetic, the return of Jews to the land of Israel, a movement known as Aliyah, which means ascent in Hebrew. Since the creation of the State of Israel in 1948, millions of Jews from around the world have emigrated to the land of their ancestors, driven by political, religious, economic, and spiritual reasons. However, in recent decades, this return has taken on an even greater depth, as not only Jews from Europe or America are returning, but also ancient and forgotten communities that claim to be descendants of the lost tribes of Israel. One of the most fascinating and moving stories in this context is that of the Bnei Manasseh, literally sons of Manasseh, a community living in the remote states of Manipur and Mizoram in northeastern India on the border with Myanmar, Burma. Their oral tradition claims that they descend from the tribe of Manasseh, one of the 10 tribes of the northern kingdom of Israel, exiled by the Assyrians in 722 before Christ. After their expulsion, their ancestors began a long pilgrimage eastward. Their migration is believed to have taken them through Persia, Afghanistan, and Tibet, until they reached regions of southwestern China, where they lived in a cave called Sinlung. From there, they continued their migration toward southern Asia. During the expansion of Alexander the Great's empire, around the 4th century before Christ, the paths of the diaspora are believed to have opened even further. It was precisely during this period of great movements of peoples and cultures that the ancestors of the Bnei Manasseh crossed into the Indian subcontinent, eventually settling in what is now northeastern India. Despite being completely isolated from the rest of the Jewish people for more than 2,000 years, this community maintained customs deeply linked to the Torah. They celebrated festivals similar to Passover, kept the Sabbath, practiced purity rites, and maintained belief in one true God. However, with the arrival of Christian missionaries in the 19th century, many of them were converted to Christianity, which gave rise to a syncretic monotheism. But their identity as children of Israel was never completely erased. It was only in the 20th century, with access to the Bible in their local languages, that many began to rediscover their connection to the history of Israel. According to community leaders, when the Bnei Manasseh began studying the Bible, they were surprised to discover that many of the stories, customs, and practices of the people of Israel overlapped with their own. They celebrated annual festivals very similar to the biblical festivals, and several of their rituals related to birth, marriage, and funerals bore a remarkable resemblance to ancient Judaism. Furthermore, they claimed to be descendants of a great ancestor called Manasseh, whose figure and characteristics match the descriptions of Manasseh, son of Joseph. In 1951, one of their tribal leaders claimed to have had a revelatory dream in which he was shown that the ancestral land of his people was Israel. From that moment on, several members of the community began to regain awareness of their Israelite heritage. During the 1970s, the Bnei Manasseh began a process of studying and practicing Judaism with the firm intention of returning to the faith of their ancestors and reconnecting with their spiritual roots. This awakening caught the attention of rabbinical authorities in Israel. In 2005, one of Israel's 2 chief rabbis, Sephardic Rabbi Shlomo Amar, officially recognized the Bnei Manasseh as descendants of one of the lost tribes of Israel. However, to fully integrate into modern Jewish life, they were required to undergo a formal conversion and apprenticeship process. Since then, thousands of them have made Aliyah, immigration to Israel, and many even bear the surname Manasseh. Such is the case of Sarah, a 78-year-old woman who states, "Since I was a child, I was taught that our family's greatest desire was to immigrate to Israel. This is the land of our ancestors." Sarah Manasseh arrived with mixed feelings. She left 5 of her children behind in India, but was able to reunite with one of her daughters who was already living in Israel, in the Kiryat Arba settlement near Hebron. The return of the Bnei Manasseh has not been easy. Many have faced difficulties adapting, language and cultural barriers, and even discrimination based on their Asian physical features, sometimes being perceived as Chinese. But despite the challenges, their determination to regain their identity as part of the people of Israel has outweighed any obstacles. Currently, it is estimated that around 6,500 members of the Bnei Manasseh community remain in India, awaiting the opportunity to emigrate to Israel and reunite with their families. However, the situation has become increasingly critical. In 2023, a violent ethnic conflict erupted in the northeastern Indian state of Manipur, putting the B'nai Manasseh community at grave risk. Increasing violence and civil unrest have made their rescue and resettlement in Israel urgent. Michael Freund, founder and president of Shavei Israel, an NGO that has been promoting immigration of lost or hidden Jewish communities for over 2 decades, has strongly called on the Israeli government to intervene immediately and allow the aliyah of the remaining B'nai Manasseh. In the face of increased violence, Freund warned that the B'nai Manasseh community is at high risk. In fact, several of its members have been injured and even killed, and at least 2 synagogues, along with a valuable Torah scroll, were destroyed amid the riots. We offer a prayer to God asking for his intervention so that the B'nai Manasseh who remain in India can finally make their aliyah to Israel. Many thousands of them have already achieved this, and their arrival not only represents a process of social integration. For many religious Jews and scholars of prophecy, the return of this lost tribe constitutes the direct fulfillment of the words of the prophet Isaiah. And he will set up an ensign for the nations and will gather the outcasts of Israel and assemble the dispersed of Judah from the 4 corners of the earth. Dear listener, in a broader context, the return of the Jewish people to Israel, including dispersed and almost forgotten communities, represents an unprecedented historical phenomenon. It is important to emphasize that this movement is not limited to India alone. In Ethiopia, Jews known as Beta Israel have also returned in waves to Israel, while communities in Latin America, China, Afghanistan, Nigeria, and other parts of the world have begun to reclaim their identity as descendants of Israel. The global return of the Jewish people is not only a story of migration or geopolitics, but also of redemption, of historical memory, and for many the fulfillment of biblical prophecies, such as those found in Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, which speak of God gathering his people from among the nations and bringing them back to their land. Let's look at what the book of Ezekiel, chapter 36, verse 24 declares. "And I will take you from the nations, gather you from all countries, and bring you to your own land." This passage from Ezekiel is part of one of the most hopeful and restorative prophecies addressed to the house of Israel during their dispersion. This verse must be understood within the broader context of Ezekiel chapters 36 and 37, where God, through the prophet, promises both physical and spiritual renewal for his people after they had been scattered among the nations because of their sin and idolatry. As we have been reflecting throughout its history, Israel went through different periods of exile. First, the 10 northern tribes were taken captive by the Assyrian Empire, and later, the kingdom of Judah was deported to Babylon. This punishment was a direct consequence of their rebellion against God, their breaking of the covenant, and their surrender to idolatry. However, God's redemptive character is manifested in that, even when he judges, he always leaves a door open for restoration. In this verse, God not only announces the end of punishment, but also personally takes the initiative for restoration. "I will take you, I will gather you, I will bring you." It is not the efforts of the people or the merit of their works that bring about this return, but the pure grace, faithfulness, and sovereign purpose of God. It is crucial to understand that this prophecy is not limited to the return from Babylon in the 6th century before Christ, but has a much broader scope, pointing to a future and global return. The expression of the nations and of all lands implies a much greater dispersion, which took place after the destruction of the temple in 70 after Christ, and the subsequent diaspora that took the Jewish people to every corner of the world. Therefore, Ezekiel chapter 36, verse 24 is best interpreted as an end-time prophecy, in which God will sovereignly gather his scattered people back to the land of Israel. This physical return to earth is also the prelude to a spiritual renewal, which the text develops in the following verses. "I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit within you." That is, the return to earth is not an end in itself, but the beginning of a comprehensive restoration that includes cleansing from sin, renewal of the heart, and restoration of the relationship with God. It is a work of both national and individual transformation and clearly points to the new covenant announced by Jeremiah and ratified by Christ in the gospel. From a theological perspective, many scholars agree that this passage highlights God's immutable nature regarding the promises he made to Israel. Although the people failed, God has not revoked his plans. The covenant made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob remains in effect, and the Lord remains faithful to his promise, committed to its literal fulfillment. This truth was also clearly understood by the Apostle Paul, who wrote the following in Romans chapter 11, verses 25 to 27. "For I do not want you, brothers, to be ignorant of this mystery, lest you should be conceited. A hardening in part has happened to Israel, until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in, and then all Israel will be saved, as it is written. The deliverer will come from Zion, who will turn wickedness away from Jacob, and this will be my covenant with them, when I take away their sins." This passage represents one of the most revealing and profound texts in the New Testament regarding the future of Israel within God's redemptive plan. The Apostle Paul, moved by the Holy Spirit, exhorts Gentile believers not to fall into spiritual arrogance, reminding them that Israel's current hardening is not absolute or permanent, but partial and temporary. Paul calls this a mystery, that is, a truth previously hidden in God's plans, but now revealed through the gospel, that Israel has been hardened in part, while a time determined by God is fulfilled, the full entry of the Gentiles into the redeemed people. This fullness of the Gentiles refers to the period in which God is extending his saving grace to the non-Jewish nations, forming a spiritual body, the church, composed of Jews and Gentiles reconciled in Christ. However, this stage does not nullify God's eternal plan for Israel. Paul categorically states that once that time is fulfilled, all Israel will be saved. This expression does not mean that every individual Israelite will be automatically saved, but rather that there will be a national, massive, and authentic conversion of the Jewish people in the end times. The spiritual hardening that has covered Israel will be removed by the same God who allowed it, and the people will recognize the Messiah they rejected, Jesus Christ, as their true Savior and King. Paul supports this statement with a direct quote from Isaiah, stating that the deliverer will come from Zion, that is, the promised Messiah, who will turn ungodliness away from Jacob. This setting aside implies a profound transformation. God will not only forgive their sins, but will cleanse their hearts. The covenant Paul refers to is the new covenant announced by the prophets, in which God would not only forgive Israel's transgressions, but would also write his law on their hearts, giving them a new spirit. This passage should not be interpreted simply as a historical statement or a theological observation, but as a living promise that connects the Old and New Testaments. God has not cast off Israel. His faithfulness remains intact, and although the people have stumbled, the Lord remains firm in his covenants. Israel's destiny does not depend on political circumstances or human decisions, but from the unchanging heart of a God who has promised to restore it. And this restoration will not be due to its own merit, or because Israel is more righteous or more spiritual, but because God is faithful and always keeps his word. As it is written, God is not a man that he should lie, nor a son of man that he should repent. In this regard, it is important to remember that in the Old Testament there are numerous promises that God made to Israel that have not yet been fully fulfilled. However, the time will come when each of those promises will be fulfilled, and among them is the promise that the 12 tribes of Israel will be reunited once again. It is especially significant that the book of Revelation in chapter 7, verses 4 through 8, makes a clear reference to this future restoration. "And I heard the number of those who were sealed. 144,000 were sealed out of all the tribes of the children of Israel. Of the tribe of Judah, 12,000 were sealed. Of the tribe of Reuben, 12,000 sealed. Of the tribe of Gad, 12,000 sealed. Of the tribe of Asher, 12,000 sealed. Of the tribe of Naphtali, 12,000 sealed. Of the tribe of Manasseh, 12,000 sealed. Of the tribe of Simeon, 12,000 sealed. Of the tribe of Levi, 12,000 sealed. Of the tribe of Issachar, 12,000 sealed. Of the tribe of Zebulun, 12,000 sealed. Of the tribe of Joseph, 12,000 sealed. Of the tribe of Benjamin, 12,000 sealed." In this passage from the book of Revelation, the Apostle John takes us to a scene that occurs just after the breaking of the first 6 seals of God's judgment. Before the 7th seal is opened, all judgment is momentarily stopped so that 144,000 servants of God may be sealed on earth. Verse 4 tells us, "And I heard the number of those who were sealed. 144,000 were sealed out of all the tribes of the children of Israel." Many modern interpreters have claimed that this number symbolically represents the church, but the text does not support this. John does not say that they are like the tribes of Israel, but that they come from them, and he mentions them by name: Judah, Reuben, Gad, Asher, Naphtali, Manasseh, Simeon, Levi, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph, and Benjamin. This list is exclusive to the Jewish people, not the church. The church had already been raptured before this event. And what we see here is the election and sealing of believing Jews who will be witnesses of the gospel during the time of tribulation, when the church is no longer on earth. Now it is notable that the tribe of Manasseh, son of Joseph, is included in this list, taking the place of the tribe of Dan, which is not mentioned among the 144,000 Israelites sealed in Revelation chapter 7. This inclusion is deeply symbolic, as Manasseh represents the fruit of God's faithfulness beyond the geographical borders of Israel. Manasseh was part of the 10 northern tribes that were scattered after the Assyrian conquest, and for centuries were believed to have disappeared among the nations. However, as we have already considered, in our days we are witnessing an extraordinary fact: the return of the Bnei Manasseh, a community from India that has preserved ancestral traditions that point to an origin in the tribe of Manasseh. Hundreds of them have already returned to Israel, making Aliyah, fulfilling the biblical prophecies that spoke of the return of the scattered people to their ancestral land. This fact is clear evidence that the scriptures are fulfilled literally. Manasseh, who for centuries seemed to have disappeared, appears in this prophetic list of Revelation because God has promised to restore all the tribes, and he does not forget a single one. The return of the Bnei Manasseh to Israel is just one example of the grand plan of restoration that is unfolding before our eyes. For us as Bible students, this encourages us to fully trust in God's faithfulness. He keeps his promises, and his word is accurate. This scene not only speaks to us of the judgment to come, but also of God's love and order in calling, preserving, and using a remnant of Israel for his eternal purposes. And so we come to the end of this video. We sincerely hope that the information shared has been useful and enriching for you, and that it has contributed something valuable to your understanding or interest in the topic discussed. We greatly appreciate your time and attention, and we'd love for you to join us for the next video. See you soon. God bless. The history of Israel is not just an ancient tale. It is a spiritual river that spans the centuries. Sometimes it flows powerfully, visibly, sung in psalms and proclaimed in prophecies. Other times, that river hides among the stones of oblivion, winding silently until in God's time it reemerges with power. There are chapters of that story that have been buried by the dust of time. Characters who don't appear in modern books, routes that aren't on maps. But even though the world has forgotten them, heaven has never lost sight of them. And amidst those lost routes, a burning flame appears in the heart of Africa, a strange people, dressed in white robes, praying on the Sabbath, reciting the law of Moses. Without knowing the Talmud, without hearing from the Pharisees, without contact with European Judaism or Babylonian rabbinism, but with the Torah written in his heart, with a fidelity that defies logic and a hope that defies time. The Beta Israel, Ethiopian Jews, witnesses to an archaic, pure faith miraculously preserved in the mountains of Gondar. They arrived not through conversion, but through inheritance. They learned not from exile, but from silence. For centuries, no one spoke of them, but their existence seems like a prophetic whisper, as if God had hidden a remnant in the heights, far from empires and human tradition, preserved to be discovered in the last days. Who are they really? Where do they come from? And what does their story tell us about the promises still alive in God's Word? Dear listener, today we will explore this with reverence and discernment, because when God remains silent for centuries, it is not because he has forgotten, but because he is preparing to surprise us. To understand them better, we must look at their history. In every sacred story, there are voices that resonate in the squares, and others that are heard in the caves, voices that illuminate with force, and others that only the attentive can discern. The story of the Beta Israel is one of the latter, a silent story, but one laden with heavenly signs. The term Beta Israel literally means House of Israel in the Ge'ez language, an ancient Semitic language used by Ethiopian Christianity and also by Ethiopian Jews. Beta is equivalent to Bayit in Hebrew, meaning house, and Israel refers to the covenant people, descendants of Jacob. The term is not just an ethnic name, it's a statement of identity. The Beta Israel did not consider themselves a branch of Judaism, but the true Israel, preserved in isolation, far from the corruption of external religions and post-exilic Judaism. Over time, several hypotheses have been proposed regarding the origin of the Beta Israel. First of all, according to the tradition recorded in the Kebra Nagast, a sacred book of Ethiopian history written in the 14th century, although based on oral traditions passed down for centuries, the Queen of Sheba, named Makeda, undertook a long journey from the kingdom of Cush, present-day Ethiopia, to Jerusalem to visit King Solomon. This visit is also recounted in the Bible, specifically in 1 Kings chapter 10, which highlights the queen's admiration for the wisdom and splendor of the Israelite monarch. According to the Ethiopian account, during that visit, Solomon and Makeda had a relationship that resulted in the birth of a son, Menelik I. Tradition states that this child was raised in Israel under the influence of the Davidic court and the instruction of the law of Moses. When he reached adulthood, he returned to Ethiopia, accompanied by an entourage of 12,000 Israelites, including priests, scribes, Levites, and nobles of the kingdom. This group would have carried with them a copy of the Torah, and according to some more developed accounts within the Ethiopian tradition, even the Ark of the Covenant. This last point, although controversial, has been central to the religious and national identity of the Ethiopian people. According to the story, Menelik I moved the Ark of the Covenant to Aksum, where it remains to this day, guarded within the Temple of St. Mary of Zion, protected by a single guardian monk appointed for life. Although there is no verifiable archaeological or documentary evidence to confirm this claim, it remains a deeply respected belief within the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. This set of narratives forms the basis of what is known as the Solomonic hypothesis, or traditional theory, which holds that the Beta Israel, the Ethiopian Jews, would be direct descendants of Menelik I, son of Solomon, as well as the 12,000 Israelites who accompanied him from Jerusalem. The theory argues that over the centuries, this community would have lived in cultural and geographical isolation within Ethiopia, developing and preserving an archaic and autonomous form of Judaism, distinct from the rabbinic Judaism that evolved in Babylon, Europe, or North Africa. Although this theory has been rejected by much of the academic world due to a lack of concrete historical and archaeological evidence, some modern authors have defended it or at least explored it as a possibility. Among them is Graham Hancock, a British journalist and author, who in his book, The Sign and the Seal, investigates both Ethiopian oral tradition and the history of the Ark of the Covenant. Hancock hypothesizes that the Ethiopian narrative may have a basis in reality, and suggests that the presence of the Ark in Aksum, although unconfirmed, should not be dismissed as mere legend. For his part, the 1st century Jewish historian Flavius Josephus also mentions the Queen of Sheba in his work Antiquities of the Jews. Although it does not mention Menelik or the Ark, it does confirm the Queen's visit to Solomon, her admiration for his wisdom, and the international impact of his figure in regions as distant as Arabia and Ethiopia. This provides some historical support for the idea of contact between Israel and Ethiopia in ancient times. Therefore, although Solomon's theory cannot be proven with certainty from modern historiography, it remains a tradition deeply rooted in the identity of the Ethiopian people. Its value lies not only in its literal meaning, but in how it has shaped the religious and cultural consciousness of an entire nation, giving it a direct connection to the biblical narrative and the Davidic lineage. For the Beta Israel and for millions of Ethiopians, this story remains not only a belief, but a spiritual heritage. Another significant theory about the origin of the Beta Israel is the so-called lost tribes hypothesis. This proposes that Ethiopian Jews could be descendants of one or more of the 10 tribes of the northern kingdom of Israel, who were dispersed after the Assyrian invasion in 722 before Christ. According to this perspective, it is possible that members of the tribe of Dan, one of the most frequently mentioned in this hypothesis, migrated south, crossing Egypt and settling in what is now Ethiopia and Sudan. This theory is based not only on biblical analogies, but also on Ethiopian traditions and certain religious practices that the Beta Israel retained, such as the use of the Sabbath, the observance of kosher food laws, ritual purity, and rejection of the Talmud, which suggests a form of pre-rabbinic Judaism. Jewish writer and activist Michael Freund, founder of the Shavai Israel organization, has been one of the most prominent contemporary proponents of this theory. In an interview with the Jerusalem Post, Freund stated, "Ethiopian Jews may represent one of the missing pieces of the prophetic puzzle, the restoration of the lost tribes. They are part of a mystery that is beginning to unravel in our time." Michael Freund has spent years researching communities claiming Israelite descent in remote places like India, China, Uganda, and of course Ethiopia. For him, the case of the Beta Israel is especially strong, as their perseverance in maintaining core elements of Judaism, despite isolation and persecution, demonstrates a deep and ancient connection to Israel. Likewise, scholar Edward Ullendorf, an expert in Ethiopian studies and professor of Semitic languages at the University of London, stated in his book, The Ethiopians, An Introduction to Country and People, that it cannot be ruled out that the Beta Israel people have roots dating back to very early contacts between Israel and Northeast Africa, even before the Babylonian exile. Although Ullendorf was skeptical about the literalness of some traditional Ethiopian claims, such as that of the Ark of the Covenant, he recognized the deep spiritual, cultural, and liturgical link that existed between early Judaism and the faith of the Beta Israel. On the other hand, historian Stephen Kaplan, author of the book The Beta Israel, Falasha in Ethiopia, argues that although genetic and historical evidence is not conclusive to affirm a direct descent from the lost tribes, the Jewish identity of the Beta Israel cannot be ignored, since their community life and faith reflect a millennia-old continuity of the Israelite tradition. From a theological point of view, several Orthodox rabbis, including Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, former Sephardic chief rabbi of Israel, have officially recognized the Beta Israel as descendants of ancient Israel. Based on historical testimonies and the need for its inclusion in the eschatological process of the Kibbutz Galuyot, the gathering of the exiles, mentioned by the prophets like Isaiah chapter 11 verse 12. And he will set up an ensign for the nations, and will gather the outcasts of Israel, and assemble the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth. In this context, the recognition of the Beta Israel is not only a historical or anthropological issue, but is also charged with profound prophetic and spiritual significance for the contemporary Jewish people. A third theory, the so-called local conversion hypothesis, holds that the Beta Israel are not descended from the ancient Israelites, but were indigenous Ethiopian groups who, sometime between the 4th and 13th centuries after Christ, they adopted Judaism due to contact with migrant Jewish communities, especially from Egypt or Yemen. This theory suggests that the conversion was gradual, influenced by commercial, political, or even religious relations, given the connections that existed between Ethiopia and the Semitic world. However, this position is seriously challenged by several scholars. One of the most prominent is historian Stephen Kaplan, a professor at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, who has devoted decades to the study of Ethiopian Judaism. In his work, The Beta Israel, Falasha in Ethiopia, Kaplan writes, "The nature of the Judaism practiced by the Beta Israel is not easily explained as a late conversion. Its priestly structure, its literal interpretation of the Torah, and its complete disconnection from the Talmud indicate an ancient origin." What Kaplan highlights is that the religious practices of the Beta Israel do not simply reflect an outward adoption of rabbinic Judaism, but a deeply rooted religious system, which retains characteristics of biblical Judaism prior to the Babylonian exile. For example, its emphasis on priests, Kohanim, animal sacrifices, strict observance of purity laws, and their exclusive use of the Torah, without knowledge of the Talmud or Midrash, markedly distinguishes them from any group that had converted late. Furthermore, complementary studies conducted by other researchers, such as James Quirin in The Evolution of the Ethiopian Jews, also reinforce this thesis. Quirin observes that the social and religious organization of the Beta Israel seems to derive from an internal development, rather than from a superficial cultural influence. According to him, there are linguistic and cultural traces that point to an ancient interaction with the Semitic world, possibly predating Rabbinic Judaism as we know it today. Now, a crucial question arises: what is the most accurate theory about the origin of the Beta Israel? Today, most historians and experts on Ethiopian Judaism, such as Stephen Kaplan, James Quirin, and Edward Ullendorf, agree that the most solid theory is not just one, but a combination of the second and third hypotheses. On the one hand, there is no reliable historical evidence to support the literal Solomonic story, that is, that the Beta Israel are directly descended from King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. That narrative, though deeply rooted in Ethiopia's national identity, comes from the Kebra Nagast, a 14th century text based on oral tradition, with no external archaeological or documentary confirmation. On the other hand, it is very likely that the Beta Israel are connected to ancient forms of Judaism, possibly predating the development of Rabbinic Judaism, that is, predating the Talmud. Their religious practice centered only on the Torah, with priests, sacrifices, and purity laws similar to those of the Old Testament, shows that their faith developed in isolation, without influence from the Talmudic Judaism that dominated in Jerusalem or Babylon after the 6th century after Christ. This has led many experts to believe that the Beta Israel are not simply Ethiopians who converted to Judaism. Rather, their religion was born from contact with ancient Jewish communities that migrated to Africa either from the northern tribes exiled by Assyria, such as the tribe of Dan, or from earlier Jewish colonies established in the Red Sea region and the Horn of Africa. Therefore, they were not simple converts, but neither were they direct descendants of Solomon. Their Judaism has an ancient, autonomous, and unique origin, which probably arose from the encounter between dispersed Israelites and local peoples, and then remained isolated for centuries, preserving a form of Judaism closer to the biblical than to modern rabbinic. Now, it's important to know that the Beta Israel didn't know the Talmud. They didn't know about the rabbinic debates between Hillel and Shammai. They never heard of the Mishnah or the Babylonian schools. And yet they kept the Sabbath, respected the dietary laws of Leviticus chapter 11, celebrated the Torah festivals, including a form of Passover and Sukkot. They had ritual purity standards similar to those of the temple, and had priests called Kasim, whose function was purely Levitical: sacrifices, cleansing, teaching. Theologian Edward Ullendorf, one of the first to study the Beta Israel in depth, wrote, "This village, removed from the mainstream of Rabbinic Judaism, offers a unique and surprising glimpse into what ancient Judaism may have been like before the destruction of the Second Temple." The term falasha means foreigners or exiles in Amharic and was used derogatively by Ethiopian Orthodox Christians to marginalize Jews. Although the term has become known in the West, the Beta Israel themselves reject it. They call themselves Beta Israel not as a symbolic title, but as a spiritual and ethnic confession. They believe themselves to be the house of Israel, preserved by the hand of God in distant lands. As anthropologist James Quirin writes, the Beta Israel's consciousness is not one of conversion or assimilation, but of millennial identity. They were not Jews by adoption, but by spiritual and cultural descent. Now, we want to address this topic in light of biblical prophecies and their implications. Because when we talk about the Beta Israel, we're not simply talking about a Jewish minority in Ethiopia. We're talking about something deeper, the possible visible manifestation of a prophecy spoken by Isaiah more than 2,700 years ago. We're talking about a God who doesn't forget his people, even though they've been scattered to the farthest reaches of the African continent. Chapter 11 of the book of Isaiah is one of the most majestic passages in all prophetic literature. It describes the coming of the Messiah, a rod from the stem of Jesse, a just king who will judge the poor with equity, girded with justice and faithfulness. But amidst this glorious vision of the messianic reign, a detail appears that has gone unnoticed by many until today. Verse 11 says, "And it shall come to pass at that time, that the Lord will set his hand again to recover the remnant of his people, which shall remain from Assyria, and from Egypt, and from Pathros, and from Ethiopia, and from Elam, and from Shinar, and from Hamath, and from the sea coasts." This passage is not a simple poetic description. It's an intentional geographical list, each word chosen with divine precision. Isaiah is not writing from a prophetic whim, but from the revelation of the Holy Spirit, anticipating a future gathering of the scattered members of Israel from the most distant and forgotten nations. And among them, one stands out, Ethiopia. But the most striking thing about this passage is its prophetic structure. Isaiah isn't talking about the return from the Babylonian exile. He's speaking of a future time, which he calls that time. In Hebrew, the expression is Bayom Hahu, a phrase Isaiah consistently uses to speak of the day of the Lord, the final restoration, the Messianic era. Furthermore, the text does not simply say that God will call his people. It says that he will raise his hand again, that is, that he will repeat a powerful act of redemption. The verb Yosef in Hebrew, translated as will rise again, implies a second divine intervention, a new exodus, even greater than that of Egypt. What Isaiah is announcing is not just any return, it is God's second great call to gather his people from the ends of the earth. And as we have been considering, Ethiopia appears in Isaiah's text. What centuries ago seemed impossible, that Jews could live in Ethiopia, preserving the Mosaic faith, awaiting Zion, is now a documented fact. The Beta Israel lived for centuries in Ethiopia, isolated from rabbinic Judaism, without contact with the synagogues of Europe or the Middle East. They knew neither the Talmud nor modern Hebrew. Their liturgy was in Ge'ez, their priesthood was Levitical, not rabbinic, but they kept the Sabbath, the laws of purity, and the biblical festivals. And most strikingly, they held out hope for a return to Jerusalem. Coincidence? Anthropological curiosity? Or prophetic fulfillment? For a long time, the Judaism practiced by the Beta Israel was considered an isolated branch. However, in 1973, the Sephardic chief rabbi of Israel, Ovadia Yosef, issued a historic decision in which he officially recognized the Beta Israel as Jews, based on ancient rabbinic sources and oral tradition that claimed his lineage from the tribe of Dan, one of the 10 tribes of Israel. This recognition allowed them to be included under the law of return, an Israeli law that grants all Jews worldwide the right to immigrate and obtain Israeli citizenship. In 1984, Israel carried out Operation Moses, a secret airlift from Sudan amid a terrible famine with U.S. backing. More than 8,000 Beta Israels were transported in military aircraft in the middle of the night, with the world in silence. In this regard, it is interesting to consider the story of Pnina Tamano-Shata. Pnina Tamano-Shata is an Israeli lawyer, journalist, and politician of Ethiopian origin. Recognized for being the first woman from the Beta Israel community, Ethiopian Jews, to become a member of the Knesset, Israel's parliament. She was born in Ethiopia in 1981 and immigrated to Israel as a child during the historic Operation Moses, one of the air rescue missions that brought thousands of Ethiopian Jews to the Holy Land. His life is a testament to perseverance, identity, and commitment to social justice. From a young age, he stood out for his intelligence, eloquence, and deep sense of responsibility to his community. She studied law in Israel and worked as a journalist, which brought her public prominence. Later, she entered politics with the goal of being an active voice in the fight against discrimination, promoting immigrant rights and strengthening the integration of Ethiopian Jews into Israeli society. In 2020, she was appointed Minister of Immigration and Absorption, becoming the first Ethiopian woman to hold a ministerial position in Israel's history. In this position, she has promoted programs to facilitate the Aliyah, immigration, of Ethiopian Jews still waiting in Ethiopia, as well as improving integration and opportunities for those already living in Israel. Her career has inspired thousands within and outside her community, demonstrating that faith, education, and determination can pave the way even in the midst of adversity. Now, in 1991, Operation Solomon was carried out. In just 36 hours, 34 flights transported 14,500 Ethiopian Jews from Addis Ababa, the largest air evacuation operation in modern history. Planes took off every 15 minutes. Even the seats were moved to make room for more people. Some were born mid-flight. But the migration didn't stop there. From 1992 to the present, more than 40,000 Beta Israel have been relocated to Israel through family reunification processes, humanitarian agreements, and programs coordinated by the Jewish Agency and the Israeli Ministry of Absorption. Despite this, it is estimated that there are still between 7,000 and 12,000 Beta Israel in Ethiopia, especially in Gondar and Addis Ababa, many of them awaiting authorization to make Aliyah, official migration to Israel. And here the difficulties arise. The main obstacles are bureaucratic, religious, and political. Some rabbis do not fully recognize everyone as Jewish because they do not meet modern halakhic requirements. Many must undergo symbolic conversion processes to be legally accepted in Israel. There are also accusations of racial discrimination, integration difficulties, language barriers, and unemployment. At the same time, hundreds of families are divided. Parents in Israel and their children waiting in Ethiopia, siblings separated, and communities in temporary camps for more than a decade. And yet they keep praying, they keep hoping, they keep believing, because hope wasn't planted in them by a government or by a rabbi. It was planted by the Spirit of God. Sephardic Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, the foremost authority of his generation, after carefully reviewing their history and practice, officially recognized them as Jews descended from the tribe of Dan. He said, "We cannot ignore the hand of God in this people. They have kept the Torah without knowing Hebrew. They have waited for Jerusalem without leaving the mountains. This can only be the work of the Almighty." And Isaiah's prophecy took shape before our eyes. Ethiopia is no longer just a place of the biblical past. It is a coordinate of prophetic fulfillment. Theologian Ray Pritz put it this way: the return of the Beta Israel is Isaiah chapter 11 incarnate. It is a testimony that the word is still alive, that God is not finished with his people, and that the remnant is returning, even if it comes from the most unexpected places. Today, when we see the Beta Israel walking around Jerusalem, speaking Hebrew, serving in the army, praying at the temple walls, we are not seeing a cultural phenomenon. We are seeing God's faithfulness to the covenant he swore to himself. And if Isaiah chapter 11 verse 11 was fulfilled in Ethiopia, how many more are yet to be fulfilled? Because if God fulfilled this ancient promise in silence, away from the cameras, through a people no one expected, how much more can we trust that what has not yet happened will happen? He will raise his hand again. He will bring his people back. And Ethiopia has already answered the call. Now, God's word doesn't mention nations by accident. When a land appears repeatedly in different books and in different centuries, it's not a literary embellishment, it's a prophetic sign. We already saw it in Isaiah. We saw it in Zephaniah. But now, from the sacred poetry of David, the name of Ethiopia rises again as part of a greater mystery, a scene of future glory. In Psalm 68 verse 31 we read, "Princes will come from Egypt. Ethiopia will hasten to stretch out her hands to God." This psalm is a song of divine victory. It is a poem that describes God's power over the heavens, over the mountains, over the nations. It is a psalm that celebrates God as a warrior, as a liberator, as a triumphant king. And in the midst of that celebration, David prophesies that two nations will join in the universal clamor: Egypt, which symbolizes the past of slavery, and Ethiopia, the distant, dark, and forgotten place for the ancient world. But it doesn't simply say that Ethiopia will be reached or converted. It says that it will hasten to stretch out its hands. It's an expression of deep desire, of fervent longing. The Hebrew verb translated hasten implies voluntary movement, personal initiative. Ethiopia will not be dragged toward God. She will go with joy. She will go with haste. She will go with open hands. And those hands are not just a symbol of supplication. They are the purest gesture of worship. They are empty hands that say, "Here I am." The hands of ancient peoples who may not have been recognized by human institutions, but who have been counted by God among his worshipers. When the psalmist says that Ethiopia will stretch out its hands, He's not speaking in missionary metaphors. He's speaking of a spiritual reality that would become visible in history, and that, in our day, has begun to happen. Thousands of Ethiopian Jews, the Beta Israel, arrived in Jerusalem, as we have mentioned. They did so with ancient songs, with books written in Ge'ez, with hopeful hearts, and with raised hands. What the psalmist saw as a future image became a present-day prophetic postcard. We've seen Ethiopian women dancing in front of the Wailing Wall, with tears in their eyes, saying, "We have returned." We have seen old men kiss the ground of Zion. We have seen dark-skinned children praying in ancient Hebrew. Ethiopia is reaching out to God. But it's not just those who have already arrived. It's also those who are waiting. Because in the mountains of Gondar, in the dusty cities of Addis Ababa, in the migrant camps where thousands await reunification with their families, there are hands that continue to rise. There are prayers that continue to rise. Every Saturday, the Shema Israel is heard in a Semitic language that the world ignores, but heaven understands. They too are stretching out their hands, even though their feet have not yet reached Zion. And this detail is key. The psalm doesn't say that everyone will already be in Jerusalem when the prophecy is fulfilled. It only says that Ethiopia will stretch out its hands. What matters is not the geographical location, but the spiritual position. What God is looking at is not the passport, but the heart. A people forgotten by politics, marginalized by institutional religion, and even rejected by some rabbinical circles, but honored by David's prophecy. Biblical commentator Albert Barnes wrote, "The allusion to Ethiopia is proof that God's grace would reach even the most remote corners of the known world. The image is of nations that do not wait to be called, but who present themselves voluntarily before God." End of quote. And what seemed unlikely, an African nation embracing the God of Abraham with ancestral fidelity, ended up being a living testimony to the truth of Scripture. Yes, they have faced challenges. Many of them live in Israel's slums today. They struggle with racism, poverty, and unemployment. Some feel they haven't been fully accepted. But even so, they haven't stopped reaching out. The younger generation is studying biblical Hebrew. Ethiopian leaders are founding synagogues. Grandmothers still light candles every Friday night. The soul of a people cannot be stopped when God has decreed that it is part of their worship. This psalm is more than an ancient poem, it's an eternal declaration. Ethiopia won't be a footnote. Ethiopia will be part of the choir. It will be in the final worship, not as a visitor, but as family. And if Ethiopia is returning to God, if her hands are already raised to the heavens, if her children are already singing in Jerusalem, then the prophecy is alive. Psalm 68 is happening. What David saw from his mountain, we're seeing on screens in the streets and testimonies, and this is just the beginning. Now in the book of Acts chapter 8, we are presented with a deeply significant scene. An Ethiopian official, a eunuch and treasurer to Queen Candace, was returning from Jerusalem after worshiping the God of Israel. In his chariot, he read the book of the prophet Isaiah without understanding its meaning. The Holy Spirit guides Philip to approach him, and starting from that passage, Isaiah chapter 53, he announces the Messiah to him. The Ethiopian believes, asks to be baptized, and continues his journey filled with joy. This man wasn't a pagan, he was a worshiper. And everything indicates, as many scholars affirm, that he possibly belonged to the Jewish community that had remained in Ethiopia mentioned in Isaiah chapter 11, Zephaniah chapter 3, and Psalm 68. And if these hypotheses are true, and everything points to them being so, then this man was not an isolated case. He was the first visible fruit of a prophetic remnant that God had preserved in African silence. He was one of the children of the scattered, as Zephaniah calls him. His story is not just the conversion of one man. It is the sign that God's call was already reaching to the ends of the earth, beginning with those Isaiah mentioned centuries ago. Therefore, when a topic spans centuries, books, and different biblical authors, we must understand that we are not dealing with a curiosity, but rather with a prophetic thread that comes from heaven. Ethiopia appears in Isaiah, Zephaniah, the Psalms, and Acts. It's not just an ancient nation, it's a prophetic setting, a land where God planted a remnant, a corner of the world where fidelity to the Torah was preserved without Pharisaism, without Talmud, without Babylonian influence, but with reverence, purity, and hope. And those people, the Beta Israel, continued to wait for centuries, unaware that they were already written in the Bible. They were forgotten by the nations, ignored by history, rejected by institutional religion, but never forgotten by God. The prophecy of Isaiah chapter 11 verse 11 is not symbolic, it's literal. It has been fulfilled and continues to be fulfilled. Ethiopia has begun to return. Zephaniah chapter 3 verse 10 anticipated it. Let's note what the biblical account says. From the region beyond the rivers of Ethiopia, they will beseech me. The daughter of my scattered ones will bring my offering. Psalm 68 proclaimed, Ethiopia will hasten to stretch forth her hands to God. And in Acts chapter 8, God showed us the beginning of that response, an Ethiopian worshiper who welcomed the Messiah in the desert. And all of this we're seeing, the migrations of the Beta Israel, their return to Jerusalem, their restored worship, their preserved faithfulness, is not just history, it's prophetic fulfillment. It's part of the final pieces of the eschatological clock. Because according to Scripture, when the Messiah returns, the Jews must be in their land. Ezekiel announced it. Jeremiah repeated it. Jesus himself said that Jerusalem would be trampled again until the times of the Gentiles were fulfilled. And that is happening. The return of the Beta Israel isn't folklore. It's evidence that the prophetic stage is being set. Everything is being prepared. The kingdom is approaching. And Christ is coming. The return of the Ethiopian remnant is a sign. It's not a humanitarian act, it's a prophetic echo. God is gathering his people. God is restoring Israel. God is opening the heavens to fulfill every word he wrote through his prophets. The prophetic platform is set. And if the Jews are returning, then the king is about to return as well. This isn't a call to curiosity, it's a call to urgency. Ethiopia is back, Israel is back. And you? Because if God is fulfilling every one of his promises, he'll also fulfill this one. I will come again. And so we come to the end of this video. We sincerely hope it has been a great blessing to your life. We invite you to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share it with your friends. In this way, you'll be supporting this ministry and helping more people be edified. God bless you. Without a doubt, the Jews are the people who, throughout the centuries, have demonstrated the sovereignty of God in the history of humanity. From Abraham's first call in Ur of the Chaldees to the establishment of Israel in our own day, the existence of the Jewish people is a living chronicle of God's power to preserve a people, even in the midst of the worst storms in history. The dispersion of the Jews was not a simple consequence of invasions or wars. It was part of the divine plan announced by the prophets, a diaspora that would not destroy their identity, but rather expand it, like a seed planted in the nations. Among the many paths of this dispersion, one of the oldest and most significant was the one that led to the Iberian Peninsula, Sepharad. The name Sepharad appears for the first time in Scripture, in a short but meaningful passage. In Obadiah chapter 1, verse 20, we read, "And the captives of this army of the children of Israel shall possess the Canaanites as far as Zarephath, and the captives of Jerusalem who are in Sepharad shall possess the cities of the Negev." For medieval Jewish scholars like Rashi and for later generations, Sepharad was always identified with Spain. Thus, from ancient times, the spiritual connection between Jerusalem and Hispania was sealed. Now, how did the Jews arrive in this remote region of the ancient world? There are several theories. Some argue that the first Jews arrived along the Phoenician trade routes between the 10th and 6th centuries before Christ. The Phoenicians, master navigators, established colonies such as Gadir, present-day Cadiz, and it is very likely that Hebrew merchants also came among their crews. Other historians, such as Heinrich Graetz, claim that after the destruction of the first temple by Nebuchadnezzar in 586 before Christ, waves of Jewish refugees fled to the west, including Hispania. Flavius Josephus, the great Jewish historian of the 1st century, also suggests that after the Babylonian and Roman diaspora, Jewish communities settled throughout the Roman Empire, and Hispania is known to have been one of those regions. In fact, ancient Jewish inscriptions found in Tarragona, Lucina, Tortosa, and Merida, and archaeological artifacts with Hebrew symbols testify to an established Jewish presence on the peninsula since the early Roman period. Historian Jane Gerber, in her work The Jews of Spain, confirms that by the 2nd century after Christ, organized Jewish communities already existed in Hispano-Roman cities, participating in the economic and cultural life of the region. During the first centuries under Roman rule, the Jews of Hispania enjoyed a certain degree of religious freedom. However, this situation changed drastically after the Roman Empire converted to Christianity. Historian Chaim Beinart explains that, especially under the Visigothic kings, 5th to 7th centuries, Jews faced severe restrictions: prohibition on building new synagogues, obligation to baptize children, confiscation of property. The Council of Toledo, in several of its sessions, imposed oppressive measures against the Jews, seeking to force their conversion to Christianity. Many were forced to practice their faith in secret, foreshadowing the phenomenon of the crypto-Jews or Anusim centuries later. Now, the Muslim invasion of 711 brought a radical change in the fate of the Jews of Hispania. Under the Caliphate of Cordoba and other Muslim kingdoms, Jews found an environment of relative tolerance known as dhimmi, citizens protected under a special tax, jizya, but free to practice their faith. During this period, known as the Golden Age of Sepharad, the Jews not only survived but prospered in extraordinary ways. It was in this context that figures such as Hasdai ibn Shaprut, doctor and diplomat of the Caliphal court, and later the great Maimonides, emerged as giants of thought and culture, marking a period of splendor that would reverberate through history. From their earliest settlements to their peak, the Sephardim developed a unique identity, deeply rooted in the Torah, but also enriched by the cultural currents of their surroundings. They spoke Hebrew in the synagogue, but outside it they adopted the local languages, first Vulgar Latin, then Castilian, later giving rise to Ladino or Judeo-Spanish. They celebrated biblical festivals, but they also created songs, proverbs, poetry, and customs that reflected the joyful and nostalgic soul of their life in the diaspora. Their communities, called Jewish quarters, were vibrant centers of study, commerce, medicine, philosophy, and art. As historian Benzion Netanyahu explains, the Sephardic Jews of the medieval period were in many ways the bearers of classical knowledge in a world in transition, serving as bridges between civilizations. Thus was born the soul of Sepharad, in exile but not in defeat, in foreign lands but with its heart always turned toward Jerusalem. Sepharad was the melting pot where ancient faith and cultural vitality intertwined to form one of the most extraordinary communities of the Jewish people. But while his star shone brighter and brighter, dark winds were brewing on the horizon that would once again test his fidelity and his hope. After centuries of discrete existence on the Iberian Peninsula, the history of the Sephardic Jews reached its zenith. From the 8th century onwards, with the establishment of Al-Andalus under Muslim rule, a period of unexpected flourishing began, an era that posterity would remember as the Golden Age of Sepharad. The arrival of Islam changed the power structure in Hispania. Although subject to the status of dhimmis, the Jews found stability in the Umayyad Caliphate of Cordoba that allowed them to prosper. Chaim Beinart writes in The Jewish People in Time and Space, "Never before, nor since, has Jewish life in the diaspora reached such a degree of intellectual, cultural, and spiritual development as in Muslim Spain." In Cordoba, Abd al-Rahman III built a city that rivaled Baghdad and Constantinople. Richard Fletcher, in his Moorish Spain, describes it as a metropolis of fragrant gardens, lighted streets, universities of medicine and astronomy, and libraries that housed more books than the rest of Europe combined. It was a world where knowledge was admired, where study was a virtue, and where Jews were crucial players in the transmission of ancient knowledge. In this environment, Hasdai ibn Shaprut, an emblematic figure of this era, flourished. As the caliph's personal physician and foreign minister, Hasdai used his influence not only to protect his people, but also to foster a cultural renaissance. Jane Gerber states in The Jews of Spain, Hasdai ibn Shaprut transformed Córdoba into a nerve center where Jews, Christians, and Muslims could exchange knowledge, science, and philosophy. Under his patronage, medical texts by Galen and philosophical treatises by Aristotle became known to the scholars of Europe. Sephardic Jewish life at this time was not merely one of survival, it was one of sophistication. Rabbinical academies flourished in the Jewish quarters of Córdoba, Lucena, Granada, and Zaragoza. Known as yeshivot, where the Torah, Talmud, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy were studied with passion. Yitzhak Bayer, in History of the Jews in Christian Spain, describes, the Jewish algemas achieved an exemplary level of internal autonomy, managing their religious, economic, and social life with remarkable independence. Hebrew culture experienced an unprecedented renaissance. Inspired by Arabic literary models, Sephardic poets elevated classical Hebrew to new heights. Solomon ibn Gabirol, born in Malaga around 1021, not only composed liturgical hymns, but also wrote the philosophical treatise, The Fountain of Life, which would influence Jewish, Christian, and Muslim thinkers for generations. Benzion Netanyahu notes in The Origins of the Inquisition, the creative originality of the Sephardim redefined Judaism not as a culture of exile, but as a civilization capable of dialoguing with the highest intellectual expressions of the outside world. Special mention should be made of Samuel ibn Nagrela, Shmuel Hanaguid, who was not only a rabbi and poet, but also a military commander and vizier of Granada. His rise to the highest levels of power in a Muslim kingdom illustrates the complexity and uniqueness of this golden age. His poems celebrated not only faith, but also military glory and court life. At the heart of this renaissance is the monumental figure of Moses ben Maimon, Maimonides. Born in Córdoba in 1135, his life symbolizes Sephardic genius at its finest. A distinguished physician, rabbi, and philosopher, he wrote in his Guide for the Perplexed, "It is not possible to attain the love of God without knowledge of his creation." In his Mishneh Torah, he codified all of Jewish law with a systematicity and clarity that no other work had achieved until then. His influence was not limited to the Jewish world. His thought penetrated medieval Islam and Christian scholasticism. The poetry of Judah Halevi, a later contemporary, reveals another face of Sepharad, the soul torn apart by spiritual exile. In one of his most famous verses, he declares, "My heart is in the east, and I am at the borders of the west." Although the Sephardim enjoyed a time of material splendor, their spirit never stopped looking toward Zion, toward the promised land. The internal structure of the Sephardic communities was sophisticated. There was a judicial system of its own, where judges issued rulings in accordance with halacha. While the community boards, known as kahal, administered public funds, organized education, and oversaw social life, each community was a small, autonomous, and proud republic. Science also flourished. Sephardic astronomers, physicians, and mathematicians held prominent positions in Muslim courts. Abraham bar Haya and Abraham ibn Ezra excelled in astronomy, cartography, and philosophy. The works of these Sephardic scholars traveled from Córdoba to Alexandria, from Baghdad to Toledo. However, like every period of splendor, the Golden Age was threatened by external forces. With the rise of the Almoravids and then the Almohads, rigorous Islamic movements from North Africa, tolerance crumbled. Beinart describes, the arrival of the Almohads meant the collapse of a precarious system of coexistence. Thousands of Jews were forced to convert, go into exile, or die. The academies closed, the scholars emigrated or died, the synagogues were transformed into mosques. Maimonides' family fled, wandering from city to city until they found refuge in Egypt. The Golden Age had come to an end, not in an immediate burst of violence, but in a slow disintegration, in a loss of confidence that would forever mark the memory of Sepharad. But its legacy was already immortal. The light lit in Córdoba, Granada, Zaragoza, and Lucena would continue to shine in the hearts of the descendants of Sepharad, scattered across the continents. To this day, When a poem in ancient Hebrew is sung in a Sephardic synagogue, when an Andalusian codex is opened in a library, when a prayer is whispered in Ladino in Jerusalem, the echo of that glorious golden age lives on, reminding us that Sepharad was not just a place. It was a promise that even in dispersion, the soul of Israel can be a torch for the world. As the echoes of the golden age faded, a new and terrible chapter began to be written for the Jews of Sepharad. The rise of the Catholic monarchs and the consolidation of the political unity of Castile and Aragon brought with them a climate of growing religious intolerance. The Spain emerging from the Reconquista sought the homogeneity of the Catholic faith as the foundation of its national identity. In this vision, Jews became the other, the suspect, the obstacle that needed to be eliminated. Pressure against the Jews was not new, but it intensified in the second half of the 15th century. The preaching of fanatic friars, like Vicente Ferrer, he sowed hatred in the cities, while Jewish converts who had often embraced Christianity by force were constantly watched with suspicion. Historian Henry Kamen, in the Spanish Inquisition, explains, "The obsession with blood purity created a social system in which Jewish origin was seen as an indelible stain beyond professed faith." In this tense climate, Isabella and Ferdinand decided to eradicate any trace of Jewish influence. On March 31, 1492, in the newly conquered city of Granada, they signed the fateful Edict of Expulsion. The text was clear and devastating. "We command all Jews, men and women, to leave our kingdoms under penalty of death and confiscation of all their property." They were offered no option to remain Jews. The only alternative was immediate conversion or exile. They were forbidden to take gold, silver, weapons, or horses with them, and in many cases, their property was sold at miserable prices or confiscated. Henry Kamen notes, "The Edict of Granada was not an isolated act of intolerance, but the culmination of a deliberate policy of religious exclusion that had been brewing for decades." Between 100,000 and 200,000 Jews were forced to leave the land they had inhabited for more than 1,000 years. Yitzhak Beer, in A History of the Jews in Christian Spain, writes, "For the Sephardim, the expulsion was experienced as a second destruction of the temple, a catastrophe not only national but cosmic. The exodus was brutal. Entire families set out for unsafe ports. Many were robbed along the way. Others were tricked by sailors who abandoned them on hostile shores. Some perished in shipwrecks or on fatal voyages to North Africa. The luckiest found refuge in the Ottoman Empire, where Sultan Bayezid II reportedly said, 'You say Ferdinand is wise, but he impoverishes his kingdom and enriches mine.' Meanwhile, those who chose to remain through forced conversion also found no peace. The Inquisition, established in 1478, monitored the converts, looking for signs of secret Judaism. Benzion Netanyahu emphasizes in The Origins of the Inquisition, "Conversion was not an honorable way out. It was a path of suspicion, constant humiliation, and veiled persecution." Thus were born the crypto-Jews, or forced anisim, who in the darkness of their homes continued to light candles on Shabbat, whisper prayers in Hebrew, or abstain from eating pork, while publicly pretending to be Christians. The Edict of Expulsion marked a turning point. The cities of Toledo, Seville, Zaragoza, and Córdoba, which had been vibrant centers of Jewish life, fell silent. Synagogues were transformed into churches. Jewish cemeteries were abandoned or desecrated. The cultural, scientific, and economic contribution that the Jews had made to Spain disappeared in a matter of months. The loss was immense, not only for the Jews, but also for Spain. Henry Kamen states, "The expulsion of the Jews eliminated some of Spain's most brilliant and productive minds, initiating a process of cultural and intellectual impoverishment that the country would be unable to reverse." But the memory of Sepharad was not extinguished. The Sephardim took with them their ancient keys, the keys to the houses they could never recover, their Ladino songs, their blessings, their customs. In Thessaloniki, Istanbul, Fez, Amsterdam, and Livorno, they rebuilt their lives, establishing communities where the memory of Sepharad was venerated as a sacred treasure. In the new lands, they continued to remember the lost cities. They continued to recite the name of Sepharad in their prayers. They continued to dream of returning, not only to Jerusalem, but also, in some way, to the spirit of that lost homeland. Today, in the surviving Sephardic songs, in the preserved culinary traditions, in the prayers recited in a Ladino that blends centuries of history, the pain of that tragedy still throbs. A pain that didn't destroy, but rather strengthened their identity. Sepharad was snatched from their hands, but not from their soul. And as long as a Sephardi remembers, sings, worships, or teaches their children who they are, Sepharad will live on. Now on July 31st, 1492, when the deadline granted by the Catholic monarchs expired, the streets of Sepharad saw their children leave. The Sephardic Jews undertook the bitter exodus to unknown lands, taking with them not only their meager possessions, but also their memories, their prayers, and their unwavering faith. The Sephardic diaspora had begun. The paths of exile were many and painful. Some crossed the Strait of Gibraltar to Morocco and Algeria. Others sailed to the Ottoman Empire, where they were hospitably received by Sultan Bayezid II, who reportedly declared, according to Aaron Rodriguez in Sephardim, a cultural journey. Those who expel the Jews from their kingdom are the true impoverishers of their land. Thessaloniki, Istanbul, Izmir, Jerusalem, Damascus, and Safed became new homes for the exiles. In each place they arrived, they rebuilt their communities with remarkable vitality. They created synagogues, founded schools, re-established their religious courts, and cultivated the traditions they had brought with them from distant Sepharad. The Ladino language, Judeo-Spanish, became the bridge between generations. It was the language of everyday life, of commerce, of songs, but also of prayers. Jane Gerber states in The Jews of Spain, Ladino became the Sephardim's portable homeland, a linguistic sanctuary where the memory of Spain survived intact for centuries. Songs like Adio Querida and La Rosa en Floreci resonated in Ottoman courtyards and Maghrebi markets, carrying in their verses the nostalgia for a lost land and the hope of a future still dreamed of. Sephardic religious life remained intense. In Safed, in the Galilee region, an extraordinary spiritual renaissance took place in the 16th century. There, figures such as Rabbi Yosef Karo, author of the Shulchan Aruch, the most important codification of Jewish law since the Middle Ages, renewed the soul of Judaism. Chaim Beinart describes this phenomenon in the Sephardic legacy. The Sephardic diaspora, far from extinguishing the spirit of Sepharad, reshaped it as a beacon of wisdom for the Jewish world as a whole. However, life in exile was not without new trials. In the following centuries, Sephardim in North Africa faced political instability and intermittent discrimination. In the Ottoman Empire, although they enjoyed relative tolerance, they had to live as a minority under laws that relegated them to the background. Even so, they endured. Sephardic pride did not crumble. They zealously preserved their customs, weddings adorned with Ladino songs, Passover celebrations with dishes inherited from their Spanish grandparents, wise sayings passed down as a sacred heritage. The sense of belonging to a larger history, the history of Sepharad, remained alive in every daily gesture. As modernity expanded in the 19th century, many Sephardim also settled in the Americas. Cuba, Mexico, Venezuela, Brazil, and later, the United States received new waves of Sephardim fleeing conflicts in the Balkans, Turkey, and North Africa. Everywhere they went, they kept their hearts beating toward their dual identity: eternal Jews, irreplaceable Sephardim. And so, while time devoured empires and transformed nations, the soul of Sepharad remained alive. They continued to pray with the same petitions passed down from generation to generation. They continued to teach their children to remember that, although the ground they stood on was different, their roots remained deep in a land they no longer owned, but which they never stopped loving. The Sephardic diaspora was not a simple forced emigration. It was the continuation of a testimony. The testimony that no human decree, no royal edict, no inquisition, it can extinguish the heritage sown in the heart by faith, pain, hope, and love for memory. Today, centuries later, when listening to a song in Ladino, opening an ancient Sephardic siddur, or saying a blessing passed down from parents to children, one hears the echo of Sepharad. An echo that says, "They took us from our land. but they couldn't tear our identity from us. Sepharad lives on as long as the memory of its children lives on. For centuries, the children of Sepharad wandered through foreign lands, carrying in their hearts a promise that neither time nor persecution could erase. The certainty that one day they would return to the land God had promised them. Their footsteps echoed in the streets of Thessaloniki, in the courtyards of Fez, in the souks of Istanbul, in the synagogues of Izmir, in the squares of Amsterdam. Although their homeland seemed lost, their souls continued to look toward Zion. This hope was not simply a longing. It was a promise sealed in the scriptures. The prophet Isaiah proclaimed in chapter 11, verse 12 of his book, "And he will set up an ensign for the nations, and will gather the outcasts of Israel, and assemble the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth." And the prophet Obadiah, even more specifically, wrote in chapter 1, verse 20, "And the captives of this army of the children of Israel shall possess the Canaanites unto Zarephath, and the captives of Jerusalem, which are in Sepharad, shall possess the cities of the Negev." It wasn't a utopia, it was a divine decree. The dispersed people of Sepharad would be called back, not just to any place, but to the southern desert, the Negev, waiting to be made green again by their hands. Although the world forgot, God did not forget. In the 20th century, after centuries of exile and persecution, the miracle began to unfold. On May 14, 1948, the State of Israel was proclaimed, fulfilling the vision of Isaiah chapter 66, verse 8. Has anyone ever seen anything as strange as this? Who has ever heard of such a thing? Was a nation born in a single day? Was a country born in a single instant? But by the time Jerusalem's labor pains begin, her children will already have been born. Israel was reborn in a single day. The nation of dry bones, scattered and thought dead, was brought back to life. The Sephardim, scattered for 500 years, heard the call, and they began to return from all the places where exile had taken them. From Morocco, where the largest Sephardic community lived, entire caravans departed for ports such as Casablanca, Rabat, and Tangier. From Tunisia and Algeria, families boarded boats that would take them to Marseille, and from there, in small vessels, they would sail to Haifa and Tel Aviv. From Turkey, from the ancient synagogues of Izmir, Istanbul, and Bursa, thousands of Sephardim set out on the journey. From Syria and Egypt, amidst increasing persecution, they escaped in makeshift caravans, crossing hostile borders to reach Cyprus or Beirut, and from there to the new state of Israel. From the Balkans, Greece, Bulgaria, Macedonia, Sephardic Jews who had survived the Nazi occupation and post-war anti-Semitism boarded overcrowded ships, like the famous Exodus 1947, braving blockades, hunger, and storms. In just 2 decades, more than 600,000 Jews from Muslim lands immigrated to Israel, including hundreds of thousands of Sephardim. Approximately 250,000 arrived from Morocco alone. Thousands more departed from Tunisia, Algeria, Libya, Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, and Egypt. It is estimated that more than 60% of the Sephardim from North Africa, the Ottoman Empire, and the Balkans returned to Zion between 1948 and 1970. The journey wasn't easy. Many crossed the sea in overcrowded boats. Others walked for days in hostile deserts. Some arrived with little more than their faith, their worn siddurim, their keys to houses that no longer existed, and the living memory of Sepharad. But they also carried with them the most valuable thing, the certainty that they were fulfilling a promise sealed since the days of Isaiah, Obadiah, and Ezekiel. Howard Sachar wrote in A History of Israel, "The founding of Israel was not simply a political act. It was the tangible realization of dreams and prophecies that never ceased to beat in the hearts of the dispersed." Jane Gerber, in The Jews of Spain, comments, "The return of the Sephardim was not a simple geographical return. It was the consummation of a millennia-old covenant, passed down through generations who refused to forget." And so it was. The dry fields of the Negev began to flourish. In Beersheba, Dimona, Ofakim, and Yeruham, new generations of Sephardim planted wheat, olive trees, and vineyards. What the prophets had seen in visions was now being felt under the burning sun of Israel. Every Sephardic child running through the schoolyards of the Negev, every elder singing in Ladino under the stars of Jerusalem, every family lighting Shabbat candles in a restored land, is a living testimony that God is faithful. Aaron Rodriguez in Sephardim, A Cultural Journey concludes, the return of the Sephardim not only closed the cycle of exile, it was the definitive vindication of an identity, a faith, and an eternal promise. Isaiah had announced it, Obadiah had sealed it, and Israel saw it fulfilled before their eyes. Sepharad did not die. Sepharad did not disappear. Sepharad was restored. And while the children of Sepharad light their candles in Jerusalem, while the fields of the Negev turn green under their hands, God's eternal words resonate in every corner of the promised land. For I will plant them in their own land, and they will never again be uprooted from the land I have given them. Therefore, the history of Sepharad is not simply the history of a people, it is the history of God's faithfulness to His word. From the banks of the Guadalquivir to the shores of the Bosphorus, from the deserts of Africa to the streets of Thessaloniki, from the synagogues of Fez to the courtyards of Istanbul, the memory of Sepharad survived centuries of exile, pain, and deferred hope. When the synagogues were closed, when foreign languages replaced Ladino, when house keys rusted in the hands of the exiles, Sepharad lived on, not in the stones, not in the walls, but in the heart of every Sephardic Jew who believed that one day the ancient promises of the prophets would be fulfilled. Let us quote Obadiah chapter 1 verse 20 again. And the captives of Jerusalem who are in Sepharad will possess the cities of the Negev. Today, the green fields of the Negev, the flags of Israel waving over Jerusalem, the Sephardic synagogues teeming with life, are living proof that God does not lie, that His promises never expire, that time, distance, and adversity cannot prevent His word from being fulfilled. Sepharad was not defeated by expulsion. Sepharad was not extinguished by exile. Sepharad was preserved in the fire of faith, and today, planted in the land of Israel, it flourishes as an eternal testimony that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is faithful to fulfill all that He has promised. However, the story is not yet complete. Although hundreds of thousands have returned, many more children of Sepharad and of all Israel have yet to respond to the eternal call. There are still scattered communities in America, Europe, and Africa awaiting their hour. The prophesied return is still underway. The restoration of Israel is a living process, like a river that has not yet fully reached the sea. God continues to call, and those who hear His voice know that the promise has not expired. And as Jerusalem is covered in light at dusk, as in the Negev, the wind caresses the olive trees planted by Sephardic hands, an ancient melody seems to rise from the corners of the Jewish soul. The people have returned to their land. Hope has returned to their home. Sepharad has returned to the eternal promise. The story doesn't end here. Sepharad lives on, Israel lives on, and the eternal covenant continues, invincible, like a flame that will never be extinguished. And so we come to the end of this video. We sincerely hope that all the content shared has been of great help to your life and to your personal and spiritual growth. Thank you for joining us this far. We invite you to continue learning and strengthening your faith with us. May the Lord bless you abundantly. We'll meet again, God willing, in the next video.